Welcome to another Dr. Sadler's Honest Book Reviews. The book that we're looking at today is kind of an unusual one, and I will say that it was a gift that was sent to me by my colleague, Simon J.E. So it is called The Poet and the Sage, A Journey Beyond the Distant Hills, and so I'll be talking about all sorts of ins and outs of this. This series is one that's oriented primarily to philosophy, and what we've got here is a book of philosophy, very much in the framework, a narrative framework of story and poetry. So, the book is really well aptly named, Poet and Sage, Poetry and Wisdom. So let's jump into the review. I always like to begin by talking about three big S's: style, structure, and summary. So why don't we start this time with style, right? So I mentioned that it's a book of poetry, and it certainly is in significant parts. The rest of it is numbered paragraphs like you see here. So it's prose of a certain sort and lots of poetry. I'll also mention as well that it is a book whose format itself, its physical format, is supposed to be aesthetically pleasing. So you notice this really nice cover image, and then when you look inside, this is kind of old-fashioned, old-timey book design, right? Some beautiful imagery there, and on the back part, the book itself is really quite nice. It's even got this great little reading ribbon. So it's essentially, laid out like an old-timey book of poetry and or prose. And, to summarize it a little bit, we could say that it falls into the genre of gnomic poetry and literature, where it's essentially supposed to be teaching you something by means of hearing about, by reading about, by observing the development of one of the main characters, the poet, in this story. So the style for it, a lot of it is actually written in quatrains, that four verse stanzas. And so I'll just read you a little bit of it right now. You can get a sense of it. This is from one of the sections that we're going to talk about later. Black smoke rose up into the sky from the dragon's bleak insistence that her power would soon befall them and would threaten their existence. And as the sun sank lower, far beyond the distant hills, they could see there'd be no mercy, for a monster only kills. And so, there's some rhythm to it, some meter, as we say. It's not, consistent in the metrical scheme, but it is rhyming, right? So we have, A, B throughout most of it. And then a lot of it is this narrative that is in these fairly short, numbered paragraphs. I'll read a little bit more of this. This is from the very beginning. The poet spent most of his time in his village cabin, sitting, listening, and searching for anything to distract him from the truth. Everything was a distraction to the poet, for he was a fool, and to him nothing on the earth was put to good use, and he was as a tree which had grown wayward under the pressure of the strong valley winds. He had not yet received the same insight as his father, the holy prophet, for though he had acquired a natural way with words, he did not value his gift, and he believed himself to be sufficient, and he was prideful, and he believed that he knew the way. The holy prophet had cared for the people of the village, and they had cared for him in return. They were better for each other, for he always spoke the truth as he saw it, and the people of the village were guided by the truth that he spoke, and they saw that the words he spoke were brought into being. It goes on from there, but you get a sense of what the style of the work is like. It's kind of old-timey. There's a lot. You don't actually get it in this, but you do get it in plenty of others. For example, in this section here of the tree, there's a lot of these and thous and ye's in it as well, right? Truth thou hast seen, righteous poet, for if thou wouldst firmly tie thine understanding to me, and if thy culture would be tied to thee, then together we shall guide thy culture, and thou wilt taste of alignment, which is eternal life. And the people of thy village will taste of alignment, and thou wilt run and play in the canopy above thee, which doth spread its lofty branches far throughout space and time. And thou wilt feel the warmth of the sun, which doth sustain the tree, and which doth sustain thee. Right? So a lot of that sort of old-timey, archaic language being used here, I think, to try to create a certain effect. So what is the summary of this? I mentioned this is essentially like a learning kind of narrative. Well, we could call it a Bildungsroman, right? Where it's about the development, the education of a younger person eventually becoming something. And really that's what a lot of the story is about. We begin with a poet who's kind of a jerk at the start, as we see, who's got a father who, had been, a great prophet, very important to the village. And then he has all sorts of interesting encounters, gradually develops wisdom step by step, begins teaching, and some of the people of the village accept his teachings, find them useful. A lot of the teachings turn out to be things that we're gleaning from other wisdom literature, from philosophy, as we'll discuss in a bit. And some of the other villagers don't like what he's doing, and they react against him. And eventually it's going to lead to a conclusion where, and I'm going to give you a spoiler here, so if you don't like spoilers, shut your ears. He's going to get killed, right? But it won't be terrible because he lives on in many other ways. So that's a summary. And what we're seeing in this work is going through all of this. And, it's arranged into some short chapters. You could sit down and probably read this entire thing through in an afternoon, and you could let yourself linger over it. So it's got a prologue, and then, an initial poem, and then, another poem, the call, and then we get to the poet himself. The poet has a dream. We go to the distant hills, to the tree, and we go on and on and on. There's even a section called The Revelations, which has a number of interesting teachings. Then we go beyond the distant hills, let his wisdom flow, and then we get to this end where he's going to be the final communion, right, and the golden way, and then the final words of the poet himself, and a soul's release. And that's it. And the book itself, 149 pages. There's a couple finishing poems. Comes the night, thy will be done. Actually, let's just read that one, because again, it gives you a good sense of what's going on. Walk in lofty woodlands, look to distant stars, eat from ancient fig trees, drink from flowing reservoirs. Spread thy roots yet deeper, reach thy branches to the sky, for the kingdom now awaits you, and thy soul must be aligned. And know that thou art everything, and nothing, and the one, and know that thou doth serve his will, which cannot not be done. So, a little bit of, again, gnomic, right? Teaching wisdom, teaching understanding poetry. So those are the style, structure, summary of this work. All right, so what are the main points or ideas? There's quite a few. I think we should talk first about the plot, the narrative structure of what's going on in here. And so we have a village that has been guided by the poet's dad, the holy prophet. And the villagers are, for the most part, a bunch of rum-dums. They have the wrong sorts of priorities. It's a good thing they had the holy prophet to help straighten them out because they value the wrong things, like money and pleasure and security and all these sorts of things. So the poet himself, as we see, I mentioned a little bit earlier, is kind of a good-for-nothing at the beginning, but he is going to have a successive set of encounters with some other important characters who are going to eventually guide him into the way. And some of this will come through actual encounters, some of this will happen through dreams. So he's going to meet a teacher within this dream. He's going to meet a seer. He's going to meet a sage. A seer is somebody who, can see beyond the normal things that we can and perhaps even predict the future. A sage, of course, is the legendary wise person. And they're all in here, and the poet goes back and forth between them at different points and is learning from them through dialogue, through discussion, through having things being revealed to him. Now, one of the absolutely most central points, you heard me mention that word alignment. That gets used a lot in this, and I kind of think, given Simon Drew's connection with Stoicism and a lot of different organizations involved in it, that alignment is supposed to be sort of a different word choice for harmony or being in accordance with. It's kind of a cool idea. I mean, it crops up, I would say, on like at least every third page, gets discussed over and over and over again. And so alignment with what? Well, with the logos. That gets also mentioned an awful lot. Gets mentioned in relation to the one, capitalized, oftentimes in all caps, and there's this contrast between like grasping these things in genuine wisdom and being like a sleeper or a dreamer like those villagers, or like the poet can be at different points. So this is a basic thematic of the work. We're moving from not understanding things to understanding things. And the poet himself is going to teach to the villagers as time goes on, and the teaching gets better and better as the poet gets better and better. So, here's an example right here. The people of the village spoke to one another about the poem, which the poet recited unto them in the village square. For some had heard, with italics, and some had seen, and some had felt, but many heard him not, though they wished to hear him. The poet prepared to speak again, and he wished to wake more from their dreams. He wished to show them eternity, even that they might know the truth which he spake. And he stood again in the village square, and he spoke unto the people, saying, The body is a river, the soul a dream and mist, a timely observation from a sage within my midst. But do I dare to wonder? Do I dare to see? Do I dare to question what this sage would teach to me? Or will I watch it flow right through one ear and out the next? Will I settle for a life wherein my soul remains perplexed? Will I value not my freedom? Will mine eyes not care to look? Could these words be providential or just some scribblings in a book? And you get the idea of what's going on there. He's sort of like leading them into his thinking. And so, what is the book essentially about? How the poet is able to develop and then articulate true wisdom and self-knowledge and even the virtues. There's some mention a little bit later on in one of the poems about the 4 cardinal Stoic virtues. And, in the narrative, the poet is going to be tried, and eventually he'll be executed while he's still engaged in teaching by people of the village. Why? Just like Socrates, they didn't truly understand his message and what he was trying to, lead them into, and they were afraid of him, or they found themselves angry at him. But this isn't a total loss, because death is not the end. Another key teaching that we find in here that's kind of cool, I think. This fits in with the alignment thing and the logos and the one is that, everything has its place and its purpose. It's just up to us to figure out what those are. And it brings in nature and culture and how we bring the two of them together. So it's pretty interesting reworkings of classic teachings, I think, that we find here. There's also, this theme, which again, very common in a lot of ancient philosophy and religious thinking that, there's this whole section called despise the flesh, right? So the body, the flesh, and, the poet gets prideful, believing the sage to be his own, believing he'd become the master of the sage, that he did not move by the will of the sage, but his own will, and he wandered off the path of alignment. And then the sage tells him, the sage reveals some wisdom and says, "This is thy way. Thou art bound by the flesh, whereas I am not, and thou art as nature is, for thou doth turn this way and that way, and thine aim has been corrupted, and thy soul doth fall even with thy flesh, and thy faith in my direction has waned," right? And he's got this dream where he's drinking from his hands from the murky water, and he's crawling as a lizard crawls, and he was in filth, and he was filth, right? So there's this kind of, let's get away from too much dependence on the body. So there's a lot of different interesting teachings, main points in this that I think are provocative, perhaps, well worth exploring. I don't think I need to say too much more about the main ideas of the work. You probably get that from what I have already conveyed to you. So now let's talk about good points of the work. So what did I find good about the work? I mean, first of all, as I mentioned already, as an object, it's a very beautiful little book, a lot of care and thought and time has gone into the production of this object, and I think this is very nice, right? There's even on the inside leaves some poetry there. I'll just read this to you. "May all who read these works be guided, even that they may see and hear and feel and know," right? Which is a reference to one of the passages we discussed already. And then it's got, a little blurb about the author here. So this is very aesthetically put together, very pleasing in that sense. The first idea of it, the story that's being told, it's kind of a cool story, I would say. Early on, we get this mission that is being discussed, which, I think is quite worthwhile, right? How do we know what the right path in life is? That's what this is exploring, right? How do we get away from, like he says, those who stuff their minds and labor by their hands, who are not aligned, who are judging nevertheless, and all that. This is kind of a good idea. The ideal of alignment, it's not just being invoked, it's being explored to some degree. So I think that's, something that is worth our thinking about through the medium of this book. I will also say that, what Simon drew, it has his poet grappling with here, and some of the others like the sage or, the teacher, are fundamental existential questions that remain unavoidable for us human beings, right? So there's this great passage in the dream. This is section 5. He says, "Teacher, I hoped thy prophecy would be untrue, so I listened not. I sat by the pond, I watched as many walked in. I saw men, women, children, families of many generations, and more multitudes walking into the pond. None came out. I wept, and I was in despair, and I did nothing. Then from among the multitudes I beheld there was a girl who smiled, and she appeared to be the same girl who had saved me from the murky depths," right? So kind of a wisdom bearer, right? And he goes on and he says, and then I saw she did walk into the pond, even with the multitudes. This was a thorn to my heart, for she appeared not to know she had been in this place of filth before. Right? So we're seeing, like, many of us grapple with what is being discussed here, seeing the procession of people going on with their lives, and it seems meaningless. It seems like it's a screw up, right, in many respects. How do we deal with that? How do we think or feel or find our way out of that? I kind of like that section which deals with the pridefulness on the part of the poet, where the sage says to the poet, the sage was angered by the poet's arrogance. He spoke to the poet directly and said, art thou so gluttonous that thou hast left nothing for me? Thou hast surely seen the roots of the cosmos, that they bend and twist and that they bring about all things. But hast thou forgotten how these things which were once hidden have been revealed unto thee? For I am with thee, and thou art within me, and we are as the light of the cosmos, and as the caretakers of the people in thy village, and even as the caretakers of eternity, have I revealed this wisdom unto thee, that thou might sit upon thy throne and bask in thine own glory. I warn thee that it is not for this reason I have revealed such things, for this wisdom belongeth not to thee, for at one moment it is with thee, and at the next it is taken from thee. So he's saying, don't be so prideful, so selfish, so egotistical. That's a good point, I would say. There's also a lot of nice natural imagery that Simon Drew is working with in this. You know, I would say I brought up that connection between nature and culture, and the poetry is exploring both of these, and so is the discussions between people. I also say, you know, Drew has a good sense for and capacity to depict all these different emotional states, all these different affects. It's not a treatise of, you know, how to become wise as such. It's an exploration, as I mentioned, existential conditions, existential solutions on the part of the poet as well. So there's, you know, quite a few things to recommend this little volume if you're into this sort of thing. Are there any features of this book that I find problematic, if not, you know, necessarily bad? Yeah, there's always going to be complaints that you can raise, particularly when it comes to poetry. You know, the appreciation of poetry is inherently subjective. I'm not a huge fan of this. I mean, I enjoy the thinking through the sentiments and the thoughts that are involved. I don't find it to be really wonderful as poetry, and I suppose that's in part because maybe I'm a bit of a stick in the mud. But it has end rhyme, but it doesn't really have meter that's consistent in it. I also do find the style leaves me a bit cold, and I think that's in part because of the thee, thou, thine stuff, which not only is, I kind of feel unnecessary. It's kind of an attempt to make it archaic when it doesn't need to be, but it's also inconsistent. So, you know, one of the passages that I read to you should have used thine in both descriptors as the possessive of something, but used thy and thine. And I just, you know, I have a hard time with that, as well as the constantly addressing people in the plural as ye, you know. Some of the language, I mean, some people might actually enjoy that quite a bit. Lo, righteous poet, if thou wouldst trust in me completely, then thy soul shall be filled from its bondage, and thy body shall be no prison, but it shall be as a holy temple. I mean, for me, that's just kind of old-timey language for the sake of making it sound cooler. But, you know, again, very, very subjective, isn't it? There's a lot of Stoic doctrines, unsurprisingly, since, as I mentioned, Drew is involved with the modern Stoic movement, that are woven in and kind of reworked, but there's not a lot of real exploration or explanation of them. It's more like hitting on them, sort of like in show tunes when there's like a little short passage in a medley that invokes this tune without really going into it. So you're not gonna, I mean, you'll be able to recognize those in this, but you're not gonna learn an awful lot from their reworkings in this. Every once in a while, there's some weird word choices that make you pause for a moment. For example, there's, and this could just be a typo, yolk, like the egg yolk, for yolk, as in the thing that you put on yourself, right? And so maybe it could have used a little bit of other eyes for editing or something like that. The poetry can sometimes feel a little bit forced, which I guess is okay for teaching poetry, but sometimes you read it and you're like, okay, that one didn't come off. I'll just give you an example of one line. And the teachers and philosophers who saw the world as skeptics all did laugh and mock the people, for their dream was dialectics. Okay, it's not terrible, but it ain't great. It's somewhere in between, and there's quite a few of those, and there are sometimes some really great stanzas though too as well. So they're perhaps balanced with each other on that. There's another interesting section that I kind of didn't buy, and this is the section of Revelations it's a whole chapter, the Revelations, right? The poet had retired to his cabin. For the evening, he went about preparing to commune with the sage. An evening storm rolled in from the east, and as soft rains fell on the dry plains, the sage whispered quiet words into the poet's soul, saying, "Wise poet, hear these words I shall reveal unto thee, and allow me to guide thy quill, even that thou might record the revelations of," in all caps, "the one." And that's essentially what this chapter is. And, it's one of those things where if you've seen a lot of this kind of thee, thou, talking about the universe as a whole, it reminds you of like parts of Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra or Khalil Gibran's The Prophet. And, maybe there's something to be gained from this. I found it kind of, like a mishmash of stuff. Sometimes there's some interesting things, For example, in section 4, the mother knocks at the door. Wilt thou let her enter? Wilt thou let her see thee naked, even as thou began in the garden? The father knocks at thy door. Wilt thou show him fine hospitality? Wilt thou now meet with him, even that thou might know him? The son knocks at the door. He is weary and famished from his travels. Wilt thou prepare him a meal? Wilt thou give him drink? Wilt thou give him rest from his wandering? So, nice holy family there. Love thy mother, honor thy father, know thyself. Oh, you're the son, see? Worship me even the way, the Logos, and the One. So, some interesting stuff there, but I don't know. I find it kind of unnecessary and unconvincing, but maybe others would enjoy it. So those are my criticisms of the work. All right, final thoughts. So if you are into this kind of literature, let's call it wisdom, conveying poetry and prose, another one that sort of comes to mind is Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, right? Well, then you probably want to get your hands on this. It's certainly a reworking of that theme. There are parts of Drew's writings that really shine forth. It can be kind of fun to sit down and think about it, right? And it is a beautiful volume. As I've mentioned, it might be kind of cool to have it and take it around just for that. And maybe you should get it. I do want to say that I really appreciate Simon sending it to me. It's a, you see this little sort of like, it's not quite a dedication, but sort of a, personalization of it. So I have to acknowledge my gratitude for that. And that's just where I'll end, It's an interesting little book. Maybe you'd like it, maybe not. But if you have the opportunity to give it a shot, maybe you should.